Hello and welcome to ECHA's webinar on getting to know the new Chesar Platform. I'm Adam Elwan and I'll be your host today. Now, over the next couple of hours, our colleagues will introduce the new platform, walk you through the main workflow, and explain what this means for both REACH and biocides assessments. Before we begin, a few practical points. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available afterwards on the ECHA website, together with the presentations and Q&A. We'll also have time for questions, and I'll explain how you can submit them in just a moment. For now, thank you for joining us, and let's start with a short overview of what we'll cover. Today's webinar will introduce the new Chesar platform and what is available in version 1. We'll show you how to create and manage assessments, build the uses tree, and add scenarios. We'll also cover how you can carry out exposure assessment and risk characterization and generate reports. You'll also hear about the main changes compared with Chesar 3 and e-uses, including scientific updates, as well as how to export information to Euclid, migrate existing Chesar 3 assessments, and find support after the webinar. Now, we'd like this webinar to be as useful as possible, so please do send us your questions during the event. You can do this by going to slido.com and entering the event code shown on the slide, or you can scan the QR code. Send questions at any point during the webinar. You don't need to wait until the end. If your question is for a specific speaker, please include their name in the question. You can also upvote questions from other participants, which helps us see which topics are most relevant to you. During the Q&A, we'll focus on questions that are within the scope of today's webinar. If we don't manage to answer your question, the answers will be included in the Q&A document published after the event. For questions outside today's topic, you can contact us through the contact form on our website. The webinar material is available from the ECHA webinars page. The presentations are already there. Note that the slides include additional slides with more detailed information than what we will cover live today, so they can also be useful as reference material afterwards. The recording will be added after the event, and we'll also publish a Q&A document with replies to the questions received during the webinar. Here's today's program. We'll begin with an introduction to the Chesar platform and its scope. After that, we'll move into the practical parts of working in the tool, starting with how to manage and create assessments, and then how the assessment workflow is structured. The middle part of the webinar will look at specific assessment areas: human health risk assessment for REACH, environmental risk assessment for biocides, and scientific updates in environmental risk assessment. Towards the end, we'll cover report generation, export to Euclid, migration from Chesar 3, and finally, next steps and available support. We have several speakers with us today, each covering their area of expertise. I won't go through every item in detail now, as we'll introduce each part as we move through the program. And with that, we're ready to move to the first presentation. We'll start with Connie Huigsema, who will give an introduction to the Chesar platform, why it's been developed, how it relates to Chesar and e-uses, what is included in version 1, and how it connects with Euclid. Connie, over to you.
Hello, my name is Connie Huigsema, and I'm part of the Chesar platform team here at ECHA. I will start by giving you a short introduction on Chesar platform. First of all, I will give you a short explanation on the existing tools which you may be using today and how we will go from those tools to the new Chesar platform. Then I will give you some first information about Chesar platform itself, the principles, the scope of version 1, some words on the relationship between Chesar platform and Euclid, and then a first glance at the workflow, which we will be coming back to throughout today's webinar. So let's start with the tools that we have at the moment, Chesar and the uses. Chesar is ECHA's chemical safety assessment and reporting tool, which was developed initially for REACH registrations. It incorporates a structured workflow to, first of all, carry out your chemical safety assessment, and then to generate the chemical safety report, also known as CSR, as well as the exposure scenarios to be attached to the safety data sheet based on that assessment. The second tool, e-uses, nowadays is the EU reference tool for carrying out environmental exposure assessments for both biocides and REACH. For REACH, the the EUSys distribution and exposure models have been incorporated in Chesar, whereas for biocides, EUSys is used as a standalone tool to calculate the environmental release, exposure, and risk for a set of predefined emission scenarios. The results for biocides are then manually transferred to the relevant assessment reports. It's good to note that not all environmental emission scenarios for biocides are incorporated in EUSys, so there are also other sources, like Excel files, for conducting the environmental risk assessment for biocides. So a new version of EUSys, version 2.2.0, was released in 2019 to include updates mainly for the biocides assessment. When we released that version, it was already clear that a further update would be needed. The IT technology used for EUSys was outdated and needed to be modernized. Further regulatory and scientific updates needed to be incorporated, and we needed to ensure that we have a maintainable tool going forward. So at that point, we decided to do a pre-study in which we investigated how to best move forward. And of course, during that pre-study, we also looked at the relation to Chesar, which, as mentioned in the previous slide, also incorporates the EUSys models. So based on that pre-study, we decided to start the development of a new common risk assessment platform, which would combine Chesar and EUSys, and that common tool has now come to be known as Chesar Platform. So, what are the principles of Chesar Platform? Chesar Platform supports both industry and authorities in carrying out their chemical risk assessment. It offers a systematic workflow to take you through the assessment step by step, and several exposure estimation tools are embedded in the tool. Once your assessment is done, it automatically generates the relevant reports in a harmonized format. If you need to make changes, that can also be easily done. The calculations done in the tool are automatically updated, and you can easily regenerate the updated reports. One important aspect of Chesar Platform is also that it brings back together the assessment approaches for biocides and REACH. Of course, at the moment focusing on the environmental assessment, as that is the part which is included in the first version of Chesar Platform. Last but not least, important to mention here also is that the intention is that Chesar Platform will replace the tools that we currently have. Chesar, which I will call Chesar 3 from now on to avoid confusion, and EUSys. So let's have a look at what is covered in the first version of Chesar Platform. First of all, it's important to note that this initial release is only in Eka Cloud services. We're also planning to make available workstation versions, which you can then install locally on your own PC, the so-called desktop version, or on a server, and we hope to have those by the end of the year. Secondly, this version of Chesar Platform supports the assessment of what we call simple substances. So you can base your assessment on one set of substance properties at the time. You cannot yet use the so-called assessment entities, which would allow you to conduct the assessment for several sets of substance properties in parallel. So for instance, if you want to assess several constituents of a multi-constituent substance, this is not supported in version 1 of Chesar Platform. For REACH, Chesar Platform version 1 aims to be a Chesar 3 equivalent, we say. That means that for simple substances, basically you can do what you could with Chesar 3. Of course, the tools are different, the format is different, and they will look different, but what you can do with it is similar. You're able to migrate your data from Chesar 3 into Chesar Platform, and as much as possible of the existing data will be kept. Good to note here that although you're able to do your full REACH assessment in Chesar Platform as was possible in Chesar 3, you see here that I've mentioned that some functionalities or features will come a bit later. To give some examples, this first version of Chesar Platform does not include some efficiency features like bulk editing, and it's also not possible to import translations of standard phrases and generate the exposure scenario for communication in any other language than English. For biocides, version 1 of Chesar Platform enables the environmental assessment for most emission scenarios. You can assess single substances. The assessment of products is not possible, although of course there is nothing stopping you from creating several assessments for the different substances in a product. Besides this, you can generate the relevant part of the risk assessment report, which in this case is the draft or actual competent authority report, or CAR. Now we have an initial overview of the scope of V1 of Chesar Platform. I would like to tell you a bit more about the relationship between Chesar Platform and Euclid. It's good to know that Chesar Platform is actually built, let's say, on top of Euclid. This means, as Chesar Platform is initially only available in Eka Cloud Services, you're able to add Chesar Platform to an existing Euclid Cloud instance. So you'll need to first subscribe to Euclid Cloud if you haven't done that yet. And after that, you will be able to turn on, let's say, Chesar Platform. You will be able to find more details on this in the supporting documentation, which I will come back to at the end of this webinar. I have also added a link here in case you would like to have some more information about Eka Cloud Services. Due to the tight connection between Chesar Platform and Euclid, it's also important to note that Chesar Platform can only connect to its own Euclid, so the Euclid instance to which it has been added. This means that at the moment, you will not be able to connect from Chesar Platform V1 in Eka Cloud Services to, for instance, any existing desktop or server installation of Euclid that you already have. Of course, that doesn't prevent you from basing your Chesar Platform assessments on a Euclid substance dataset. For the time being, it just means you need to transfer those substance datasets from your existing Euclid to the Euclid connected to Chesar Platform through import and export. Okay, as a last point in this introduction, I would like to introduce you to the workflow in Chesar Platform, which we will be taking you through step by step in this webinar. So this is just a first look at it. The assessment starts by defining the substance to be assessed, which can be done by importing a substance from Euclid or by manually reporting the substance data. When you have the substance information, the next step is to describe the uses of the substance and the underlying scenarios. So you need to basically describe how the substance is used. Then, once you have this information on the substance properties on the one side and the uses and scenarios to be assessed on the other side, you can combine this and proceed with the exposure assessment and risk characterization. You will need to provide information on the conditions under which the substance is used, and as these drive the release to the environment or the exposure of humans to the substance. Based on this and the information on the substance properties, you will be able to generate exposure estimates with the embedded tools, which are at.EEST for the environment and ISITOC TRA for worker and consumer. Note that this is only for REACH. If you have used external tools or you have measured data, you can also report the results of that manually in the assessment. Then, based on the exposure estimates, or based on, for instance, qualitative considerations, you can do your risk characterization. Once you finish your assessment, you can automatically generate the relevant reports, and for REACH assessments, you can export information on the uses and exposure to Euclid, where it will populate section 3.5. I realize that probably went very quickly, but this is just the first time we're looking at this workflow. And as mentioned, we will guide you through this workflow step by step in the coming presentations. So that concludes the first introduction to Chesar Platform. Thank you for your attention. I hand over to Eleni, who will take you through the first part of the workflow, the creation and management of assessments.
Hello, my name is Eleni Tsitsiou and I'm part of the Chesar Platform team here at Eka. I will guide you through the first steps of the workflow, which is the creation and the management of the assessments. When opening Chesar Platform, you land on the home page. Here, you can create, open and delete assessments, as well as import and export them as XML files. In addition, you can filter your assessments, access the help text, or see the version of the tool that you are using. Let's have a closer look at the Create Assessment functionalities. There are three ways to create an assessment. The first option, which is the recommended one, is by importing the substance dataset from Euclid. Note that there are two Euclid access points in this view, from where you could retrieve the UUID of the substance dataset to be imported. The next option is by defining the substance dataset in Chesar Platform. And the last option is by copying the substance dataset from an existing assessment in Chesar Platform. Once the mandatory information has been provided, based on your selected option, the assessment is being created. Here is a list containing all possible assessment types. The first assessment has been created by importing the substance dataset from Euclid, as indicated by the Euclid orange icon. The next assessment has been created by defining the substance dataset in Chesar Platform. In the third row, we have an assessment that has been created by copying the substance information from an existing assessment, which is indicated by the word copy. In addition, the substance dataset in the original assessment has been imported by Euclid, which is indicated by the gray Euclid icon. And the last assessment has been created again by copying the substance information from an existing assessment. However, in this case, the substance dataset in the original assessment was defined in Chesar Platform. Once the assessment is created, you are redirected to the so-called substance area, where you could modify the provided substance name if needed. In this area, you can browse through the substance information, which is organized in different tabs. Note the differences in the tabs between REACH and biocides assessments. By default, the information in the first tab is displayed. When not all tabs are visible, click on the three-dot icon to see the extra tabs. Now, let's have a closer look at the differences in the substance information among the different assessment types. In assessments created by importing the substance dataset from Euclid, all information coming from Euclid is not editable in Chesar Platform. However, default and properties calculated by Chesar Platform are editable. For this type of assessments, if changes are made in Euclid, those can be transferred directly to Chesar Platform by clicking on the Synchronize button. For all other assessment types in which the substance information has been either defined in Chesar Platform or copied from an existing assessment, all properties are always editable. While working with Chesar Platform, remember to check whether your calculations are still running or saved. Access the help text in case you have any question, or visit the validation panel. By accessing the validation panel, Chesar Platform will help you to identify the inputs that are needed for the embedded exposure estimation tools it uses for environmental assessments and at.TRA for worker and consumer assessments. It will also help you to identify inconsistencies in your usage tree and understand how exposure estimates are calculated in a scenario, or why exposure estimates cannot be calculated in an exposure scenario. There are 4 validation types: critical, which prevents the generation of CSR; errors, which explain why exposures cannot be calculated; and warning and information messages explaining how exposures have been calculated. We have just gone through the highlighted parts of the workflow, and that concludes my presentation. I hand over to Connie, who will take you through the rest of the assessment workflow. Thank you for your attention.
Hello again. I will now continue to take you through the assessment workflow in Chesar Platform. I'll take you through the workflow at a high level, and then my colleagues will present some further details for some parts of the assessment. As Adam mentioned in his welcome, in the presentation available on the ECHO webinars page, you will find actually some more slides than we will go through today. So you can also use those as a reference afterwards. So let's go back to this workflow. Eleni just presented the highlighted parts, and now I will move on to the assessment defaults. So in the assessment defaults, you can find information which is relevant at assessment level. You would generally not go here very often, but it's good to know where it is. There is some information on the assessment itself. Then there are some text fields for the reports at this level. And besides that, this section contains the defaults used for the built-in at.EEST models. So for instance, here you can find the standard environmental temperature, or the bulk density of soil, and other information on environmental compartments. The assessment default section is also where you are able to update the name of the assessment if you want to do that after its initial creation. So before having a quick look at the content, let's have a look how to access these assessment defaults, as this section is a little bit hidden in the tool. When you're in your assessment, you can find the link to the assessment default section directly under the name of the assessment, as shown here. Next, I will show you how to update the name of your assessment. So once you're in the assessment default section, the name of the assessment will appear in the content part of the screen. Here you can easily change the name of the assessment. And don't forget to click Save once you're done, because otherwise your changes will not be incorporated. When it comes to the content of this section, as explained, there are basically 3 types of information, which you can see here. As a first, you see the assessment characteristics, which contains information about the assessment. Right beside that, you will see a tab with text fields for the report. The names of these tabs are a bit different between a rich and a biocides assessment, but they both contain text fields for the report. And then beside that, you have the defaults for the environmental assessment. Okay, so we went through the assessment defaults. Now I will move to the next box, which is the use description. To be able to do your assessment, you will need to build a so-called uses tree, which is basically a list of uses and scenarios which need to be assessed. Under Reach, we're also used to calling this a lifecycle tree. You can build your uses tree in different ways. First of all, of course, you can add the uses and scenarios manually one by one. If the substance you're assessing has the same or similar uses as a substance you have already assessed, you can also choose to reuse part of an existing assessment, which saves a lot of time in including all the uses and scenarios manually. And then the last option, which is only applicable for Reach, there is a possibility to include so-called use maps, which are groups of uses and scenarios, including also the relevant assessment inputs, which have been prepared usually by sector associations. This slide visualizes the 3 options that I just gave you. So first of all, the plus button at the top of the tree allows you to add a use. And then once your use has been added, you can add a scenario by pressing the plus button next to the use. The other options for reusing part of an assessment or for adding a use map are in the 3-dot menu at the top of the tree. So let's have a look at these options. As we saw before, and as you can see here again in the screenshot, if you want to add a use, you can click on the plus at the top of the tree next to uses. When you do that, you will get a wizard. In the first step of the wizard, you need to select, if you're in a Reach assessment, the life cycle stage. If you're in the biocides assessment, you can select the product type, or PT. Then you go to the second step of the wizard, and there you define the name of the use. Good to note that for a Reach assessment, the name of the use can also be defined with a so-called standard phrase. When you have created the use, the view differs a bit between Reach and biocides, so I will show you both. This is a use in a Reach assessment. First, in this use, there is a tab for the use description. Here you can enter information on the tonnage, which is used in the environmental assessment, and there are also many fields where you can further describe the use. The next tab is for the further information on the use, as you can see here. And in the third tab, you can provide information for this specific use, which will be included in the exposure scenario to be attached to the safety datasheet, which we have called at.EEST in Chesar Platform. Now, let's have a look at the biocide use. You see that here we also have a use description tab, which mainly here contains the product type. And in the second tab, risk conclusion, you can specify whether the risk for this assessed use can be considered acceptable. Once you have added a use, the next step is to add a scenario. You can do that by clicking on the plus next to the use. Once you do that, you will get a wizard again, just like when we were adding a use. This wizard differs again between reach and biocides, so this view is for reach. In the first step of the wizard for reach, you need to select whether you want to add an environmental scenario or a scenario for workers or for consumers. Once you have made that choice, you need to provide a name for the scenario. And as for the uses, this name can also be a standard phrase. And once you select Add, the scenario will be added. Now we move to the view for the biocides. So in the first step of the wizard for biocides, you see that you have a number of filters. As there are quite a lot of biocide scenarios, these filters can help you reduce the list and help you find the relevant one. You don't have to use the filters, you can also leave them empty. Then in the next step, you will need to choose the scenario that you would like to add. If you haven't used the filters or the filters still give you a large list, you can also use a simple Ctrl F to search for the right scenario if you know the name of the scenario you're looking for. Once you have chosen the scenario, you see that actually in the next step, the name will be pre-filled. So you don't need to define a name yourself. It will be pre-filled for you. And all you have to do to add the scenario is to click Add. So now that we have seen how to manually add uses and scenarios, let's have a look at the other ways in which you can populate your uses tree. As I mentioned before, if you have previously done an assessment and you would like to reuse some or all of the uses from that assessment in a new assessment, you can use the reuse assessment functionality. You can find that functionality in the three-dot menu at the top of the uses tree. Once you select that option, you will again get a wizard, which will guide you through the process. You'll be able to select the assessment from which you want to reuse part or all of the uses and scenarios. And in that list that you will get, you will see all assessments in your database with the same regulatory context as the assessment you are in. Which means in practice, if you're making a REACH assessment, the list of assessments will be all REACH assessments in your database. And of course, for biocides, the same. In the next step of the wizard, you will be able to select exactly which uses and scenarios you want to add, as you can see here. For each, as said before, there is also the possibility to add a use map, which is a group of uses and scenarios in a specific sector, which has usually been prepared by a sector association. The functionality for this is in the same place as the reuse assessment, so in the three-dot menu at the top of the uses tree. And like we are used to by now, this will again open a wizard. In that wizard, you will be able to select which use maps from the ones which are embedded in Chesar Platform you want to add. And again, in the next step, which I'm not going to show at this moment, you will again be able to choose which uses and scenarios from the use map you selected you would like to add to your assessment. When it comes to use map, it's also good to be aware there is also a so-called manage use map functionality, in which you can, for instance, re-add some uses and scenarios which you had previously excluded. And the manage use map functionality is in the same place as the add use map functionality, again in the three-dot menu at the top of the uses tree. So, having now gone through the use description, we can move to the next section, which is the exposure assessment and risk characterization. When you're going to do your exposure assessment and risk characterization, basically these are the steps that you need to go through. So first of all, you start by making sure that the conditions of use, so the conditions under which the substance is used, or the inputs to releases, as we call it for the environment, are there. You add them where needed. The next step is to define for the environment the releases, or to review the defaults that have been provided there. Third step, also only for the environment, is to define or review the information on the receiving compartments. And then once that is done, you can go and add your exposure estimates by adding exposure datasets. And as a last step, you perform your risk characterization. The steps you saw in that slide are also reflected in the structure of the scenarios in Chesar Platform. So you see here the tabs which are in the scenarios. At the top, we see the tabs for a human health scenario, so a worker or a consumer scenario. And at the bottom, you see the tabs for the environmental scenarios. There's a small difference in the first tab between REACH and biocides, but otherwise the organization is the same between both regulatory contexts. If you follow these tabs, you will see that they guide you through the steps. So, as a first, you describe your scenario. Second step, you describe the conditions of use for human health, or what we call the input to releases for the environment. Then there are two steps which are only relevant for the environment. So first of all, you have the releases, and then come the receiving compartments. Then we move back into common territory. So based on the inputs that you have now calculated, the exposure estimates are calculated. And the last step, which is common, is the risk characterization. There is an extra tab, again, for environment, which is advanced information, which contains some information on extra inputs and outputs. I can also use this slide to tell you a bit more about the main changes in the environmental scenario compared to Chesar 3. And of course, this is only relevant for REACH. So the information, first of all, you see is organized in tabs instead of sections. Many of these tabs would have been in one and the same tab in Chesar 3. For the conditions of use, which used to be called conditions of use in Chesar 3, there has now been a split. There is the first part, which is the input to releases. So these are really, as the word says, input to releases. And some of the parts which were previously in the conditions of use have actually now been moved to the receiving compartments. So for instance, the information on the sewage treatment plant is no longer here, but it has moved to the receiving compartments. You will also see, compared to Chesar 3, that there are more inputs present by default than there were. So you can see more what is happening. And especially in this advanced tab, you will see information which was not visible in Chesar 3. So my colleagues will also later present some more details on the content of the scenarios and the different steps there in the upcoming presentations. For now, I would like to tell you a bit more about adding exposure datasets. So if you want to have actual exposure estimates in your scenario, you will need to add one or more exposure datasets. There are three types of exposure datasets in Chesar Platform. So the first type is the built-in tools. So you can add an at.EEST dataset to an environmental scenario, or an ESET TRA worker or consumer to the worker and consumer scenarios. You may not want to use those, and in that case, if you have, for instance, used an external tool, you can manually report the exposure estimates in an external tool dataset in Chesar Platform. And lastly, this is only implemented for REACH at the moment. If you have measured data, you can report that in a measured dataset. So those three options exist. So besides having three different types of datasets, we also have different options in which to add them. You can, first of all, add each dataset individually to each scenario. but we also have the possibility to bulk add the built-in exposure data sets. So for instance, you can add the at.EEST data set to every environmental scenario which does not have a data set yet. Let me visualize how this works. First of all, for adding a data set to a scenario. You see that here I'm inside the scenario to which I want to add the data set. And to add an exposure data set, I click this button, Add Exposure Data Sets. After I've done that, I get again a wizard. In the first step of the wizard, I select which type of data set I would like to add. So in this case, because I was in an environmental scenario, I can choose between EUSys, external tool, or measured data. When you click the next, in the next step, it depends a bit on the type of data set you're adding, you will need to add some required information. And in the third step of the wizard, we see the so-called selector properties. They have a bit of a different meaning between reach and biocides here. So for reach, first of all, these selector properties are actually the compartments for the environment or the exposure route and duration for human health. So you can select here which compartments or routes you want to include in the dataset you're adding. They're all set to no by default, but there is a convenient button here at the top, set all to yes, to help you to set them to yes if you would like to add everything. For biocides, this step of the wizard actually doesn't have any function, and you can completely ignore it. It's just a technical issue that we have not been able to hide this step from the wizard there yet. So you can leave what you see there as is and simply click on Add. Once you click on Add, the dataset is created and your view goes to within that dataset. You see here that the name is automatically created based on the information you provided in the wizard, and you can update that if you like. It's also good to be aware that in this dataset view, you can also still make changes to the relevant compartments or routes if you need, and you can do that in the Dataset Information tab, as I show here. And if you want to go back up to the scenario level, there is a back button here, which takes you back up to the scenario to which the dataset has been added. Once you're back at scenario level, you will see that the exposure estimates are now visible in the Exposure tab, as shown here. Via this button here at the top of the scenario, you can see which datasets have been added to the scenario. You can access them. You can also delete them if you change your mind. And besides there, you can also open a specific dataset by clicking on the link for that dataset in the exposure table. So that was about how you add datasets to scenarios one by one. But there is also a possibility to add dataset for the built-in tools to all relevant scenarios in one go via the so-called bulk add functionality. So you can find this again in the three-dot menu at the top of the usage tree. And you see here this functionality, add default exposure datasets. As for biocides, there is only environmental assessment. The view looks a bit different there. You see there is only one type of a default dataset which can be added. So once you have selected that option, the dataset will be added to all the relevant scenarios, but only the ones which didn't contain any dataset yet. And you can see an indication at the top how many datasets were created. Good to know here, for this option, all the compartments or routes are added by default. So you cannot go and select which ones you want to add. But of course, for reach assessments, you can go back and change that at individual scenario level. Very important also to note here is that there are still some issues with this functionality in biocides assessments, and therefore we ask you, please do not use this functionality if your biocides assessment contains any scenarios which have no release to the sewage treatment plant. So as long as there are only scenarios which release to the sewage treatment plant, it works fine. But if you have any scenarios which do not have that, please don't use the functionality. Okay, As a last step of the exposure assessment and risk characterization, I would like to explain to you about the so-called uses area, which can be accessed at the top of the uses tree. This node contains information relevant across all uses, and actually it's only relevant for REACH. So first of all, there is here information about manufacture import, which basically contains information about tonnages, imported, export, this kind of thing. And then here you also find the environmental assessment for aggregated sources. Some bullets here. So first of all, there is the total of all the direct releases. This is also where you find the regional assessment and the assessment for combined widespread uses. So let's visualize that again. Here is how to access the uses area. And when you are there, you can see that here is a first tab with manufacture import and a second one with the information on the environmental assessment for aggregated sources with the components as described in the previous slide. So now we have gone through the exposure assessment and risk characterization. The last part I will show you of this workflow for now is the part about generating reports. So you see here the types of reports that we can generate in Chesar Platform. And of course, it depends on the regulatory context. So for a REACH assessment, there are two types of reports that you can generate. There is the sections 9 and 10, which are the parts with the exposure assessment and risk characterization of the chemical safety report, the CSR. And you can also generate the exposure scenarios for the safety data sheet, which we have called at.EEST in Chesar Platform. If you're in a biocides assessment, of course, you need a different report. And in this case, you can generate the relevant sections of the draft or final competent authority report, or CAR. Chesar Platform also offers a nice preview of the reports where you can still edit some of the text fields if you want. And when you're ready, you can generate the report as a Word document or as a PDF. So that concludes my high-level run-through of the assessment workflow. Thanks a lot for your attention. My colleagues will now present some more details on specific parts of the assessment.
Hello, I am Celia Tanarro. I am the team leader for Exposure Assessment and Chesar in the Restriction and Risk Assessment Unit in ECA. I will explain in this presentation how to perform a risk assessment for human health for REACH. And because most of you are Chesar 3 users, I will highlight also the main difference between Chesar 3 and Chesar Platform. So you have already seen this workflow. Now we are in the exposure and risk characterization part, that, as you can see, is a very central part of the workflow. Here is where you will get, you already have all the hazard properties, the hazard conclusions, the use description, and then you will input the parameters to estimate the exposure or the emissions. You will generate exposure estimates, and then you can do the calculations either with the tools that are already integrated in Chesar Platform, so EUSES, SETOC-GRA, etc., or you can do the manual reporting of measured data or of external tools. Finally, you will do the quantitative or qualitative risk characterization to conclude on your assessment. So, as I have said, I'm going to explain you also the difference from Chesar 3. So basically, you can do the same things in Chesar Platform as in Chesar 3, but there are slight differences. Some differences are applicable to all the scenarios, so not only to human health, but also to the environment. So the first change that you will realize if you start doing an assessment in Chesar Platform is that the information is organized in a slightly different way. Doesn't matter, at the end of the day, you can add all the same information that you could in the past. Then other difference is that we are not supporting anymore the custom conditions of use. So this functionality doesn't exist. This is also applicable for the environment, and this we have done to improve the harmonization. but also to be able to still support different conditions of use, we have first included a more extensive list of built-in conditions of use. And then we have also included a condition of use where you can add free text. So there, if you have something really very specific that you cannot find in the list of conditions of use, you could add it there. And then we are also open to add further conditions of use, but that we would like to do in a more harmonized way. So you could contact ECA, and ECA and the chemical risk assessment stakeholder community will discuss about further conditions of use that could be included. And just so you know, already at the moment, we are considering whether we need to add more conditions of use to support the qualitative assessment for the occupational settings. So now you see how the information is structured in Chesar Platform. You have seen it already a bit in the previous presentations. So you see that now everything is organized in tabs. And then also that things like adding the datasets or edit the description for the SDS are always available when you are at scenario level. So they are not like in a different box, or you need to be inside some place to add them, etc. The other changes now are really specific either for workers or for consumers. So starting with workers, the first main difference with Chesar 3 is that we have integrated ESETOP TRA Workers version 3.2. This is a newer version, and then you can expect a bit of difference in the calculations. But the other difference that we have included, where we have improved the tool, is that we have modified how you do things, so you have better support to report occupational tools. So now you have more occupational tools that you can report more or less automatically. That's there you have the list. And then we also have included the tools logic fully. You will see in the next slide how this works. And then also the selection of conditions of use always happens at scenario level in the conditions of use tab, independently of which datasets are added. Before, there was a mix of adding things at dataset level and at scenario level. So how you can do this addition of conditions of use? So there are two ways. So the first one is the one where you include the conditions of use for a tool, for a specific tool or number of tools. This is what we have improved in this version. So basically you pick a tool, for instance, art, and then you can and then you get immediately the conditions of use that are relevant for the tool. Then on top of that, because art, for instance, has some conditionality, you will see that while you are editing the conditions of use and putting values there, some conditions of use may appear or disappear because of this conditionality. So for instance, outdoor, if you put outdoor, room ventilation will disappear. If you are doing a far field assessment, you will get certain conditions of use like source segregation, etc. And this before you had to do manually. And because you are adding conditions of use for a specific tool or set of tools, the conditions of use cannot be deleted unless you remove the tool. The second way of doing this is using the plus condition of use button. And there you do it really freestyle. So you can choose what condition of use you add, and you can add them or delete them. For consumers, it's exactly the same thing. So basically you have the same options as in TRA, as in Chesar 3. So these are TRA with subcategory, and manually choosing the conditions of use. For instance, when you are going to use an external tool. And one thing that was in Chesar 3 and is not in Chesar Platform is that you are not able anymore to import an external tool dataset from ConSespo. This is not supported in version 1, but you can still report any assessment performed with ConSespo by manually adding the relevant conditions of use. So you can see how it is the screen for the consumer assessments. You see that you have these include conditions of use for TRA consumer. And if you choose yes or yes with default TRA values, you will get a set of conditions of use. If you say no, then you can add whatever conditions of use you like and put the values that you want. And this is normally done when you are using other tool or measure data. Then you have the exposure tab. So of course, the exposure tab, to see something, you need to have added a dataset. This I'm not explaining because in previous presentations it has been shown that you can add datasets. But what I want you to see is that basically you have the same information that you had in Chesar 3. So you have the roots. Here you see inhalation. You have the type of exposure that is based on the effects of the substance, and then you have the exposure and the risk characterization for qualitative hazards. Then again, for risk characterization, the tab is mostly the same as you had in Chesar 3. So same way, depending on the risk characterization type, you have quantitative, qualitative, hazards or not required. So if it's quantitative, you will get an RCR calculated, and based on that, you will have the risk control or not. And for the qualitative, again, same as in Chesar 3, either you have to set it manually upon providing justification, or if it's a hazard where you can have a concentration limit, then it will be based on that. There is a slight difference, however, on how you do your risk characterization for the qualitative. So mainly the difference is that when you need to set, let's say, manually upon justification, the risk characterization to safe or to risk control yes, you have to go to the bottom of the page, you pick yes, you need to add the justification. This justification will be for all the qualitative hazards, so you might need to add a bit more than before. And then once you have done that, then you will be able to edit the risk control to yes. And then finally, there is the description for the safety dataset. This is also something that is the same for the environment. So as I have said, now you don't need to go to another box, that was box 5, before to edit the description for the SDS, and you can do it at scenario level. So you simply press the button, edit description of the SDS, and then it triggers the editability of the data for the safety dataset. So as in Chesar 3, you have sometimes a default value, and then you can change it, and it can be using free text or using a standard text. And with this, I have finished this presentation, so thank you for your attention.
Hello, my name is Adriana Lipkova. I work for the biocides unit at the European Chemicals Agency, and today I will talk about the environmental risk assessment for biocides in Chesar Platform. In this presentation, I will cover the status of the implementation of the environmental risk assessment for biocides in this Chesar Platform tool, and also I will explain the key features of the implementation. To start with, I need to explain that version 1 of Chesar Platform covers emission scenarios for multiple product types, which are listed in the first bullet on this slide. That is, we have not covered yet all of the product types. A handful of the product types are still missing. The starting point for the implementation were the emission scenario documents and technical agreements for biocides. Nevertheless, in the course of the implementation, we realized that a number of harmonization changes need to be made, and also we found out that few scientific changes need to be made. Therefore, the emission scenarios were completely updated. These changes were discussed and agreed upon at dedicated meetings of topic expert group, which involved biocides and REACH stakeholders, and also biocide working group for environment. Where relevant, we captured these changes in the technical agreements for biocides, so-called TAP document. Overall, all of the changes in the biocides emission scenarios are documented in full in the emission scenario repository documents, which are in fact documents listing all the input parameters and all the output parameters and equations which are used in Chesar Platform at scenario level. Both of these documents have been published with the release of the tool at the Emission Scenario Documents website. Now let's take a look how the implementation of these scenarios looks like. What you see right now is a screenshot from the Chesar Platform tool, and we are now at the uses or risk assessment level. On the left-hand side, you can see so-called uses tree, which is an example of uses as defined manually by the user and selected scenarios which are of relevance for the assessment of a given use. This allows the user to navigate between the uses and scenarios selected as he wishes. On the right-hand side, we can see the information related to the given scenario. In this example, the scenario which is addressed at the right-hand side is the scenario wood preservatives used in the industrial automated spraying, which is marked with this gray background. The information on the scenarios is organized in tabs. The first tab is the Scenario Description tab, which collects all of the administrative information. This information is predefined in the tool of the library, in the tool library. Some of this information may be editable, as shown in this box number 2. This information can be edited by user, in particular in cases when he or she is making changes in the scenario which are beyond the implementation in Chesar Platform. The next tab is Input to Releases. This tab shows parameters allowing estimation of releases for a given scenario. Here the user would populate empty fields, modify defaults. He or she would select values in picklist properties and give clarifications on his or her input. When doing this, this might be in particular of relevance in cases where the defaults are being changed. When this is done, the exclamation mark appears in the bubble on the right-hand side, and then the user can click on this and provide the clarification on why such change was done. The tool in return calculates output parameters and also populates properties which are substance property dependent based on the information provided at substance level. Let's take a look at the next tab, which is Releases tab. This is a tab which shows local emissions calculated by the tool by respective compartment. These values, as said, they are calculated, but they may be edited if necessary, but this is normally not recommended. The Receiving Compartments tab is very similar to the Receiving Compartments tab that REACH colleagues would see in cases of scenarios with wastewater emissions. That means it contains same parameters and it provides same option as for REACH except for sewer type, which is mixed, or which can be chosen, where you can choose between mixed and rainwater sewer. In case of scenarios with direct releases, there is a specific set of parameters presented, which is different from the one which we see currently in the box number 1. An example of a screenshot from a Receiving Compartments tab for such types of scenarios is shown in the box 2. Here, instead, we see the descriptive parameters in relation to the compartments, such as the depth of compartment, the volume of the compartment, area of a compartment, and in case of soil, also the tool provides the recalculated rate constant for removal from soil for the respective soil depth for that scenario. Let's take a look at the Exposure tab. In the Exposure tab, as already mentioned by my colleague, one can see concentrations in exposed compartments. These concentrations will appear in this tab once the user has pressed on the plus Exposure Dataset button. For biocides users, one can choose between at.EEST exposure dataset or external tool dataset. The at.EEST dataset provides you with the equations embedded in the tool, which then calculate these concentrations in the exposed compartments. The external tool dataset allows you to override, in fact, the at.EEST concentrations, Typically, biocides users would be using it, for example, when it is expected for the assessment to refine the groundwater concentration values. As, for example, in the case shown at the screen with the box number 2, where for the groundwater, we have selected, or we have added, in fact, 2 datasets, the at.EEST dataset, which is set as supportive dataset, and then we added also external tool dataset, which is set as a main dataset. By setting the external tool dataset as a main dataset, the risk characterization ratio for that dataset would be taken over for the conclusion on the risk for this scenario. Furthermore, it is important to mention that this kind of list of protection target, as you can see on this screen, is typical for the situations where we have scenarios with releases to wastewater. In case of scenarios with releases, with direct releases, the list of protection targets is a bit different and varies depending on the scenario, and in this respect with the type of release and use pattern. Furthermore, for all of the scenarios with direct releases, we've implemented also secondary poisoning assessment as provided by the ECHA guidance on Volume 4, Part B and C on the environmental risk assessment. This is shown by the box number 2. These secondary poisoning targets may be removed for the scenarios with direct releases. In case, nevertheless, that it is confirmed by the user that indeed secondary poisoning needs to be performed for a given scenario with direct releases, the user would be expected to provide the value for the reference water or soil concentration. The risk characterization tab is very similar between REACH and biocides and provides similar function. It is also very similar to the tab which we just saw, which was on exposure. The most important information in the risk characterization tab is the risk characterization ratio and the risk controlled conclusion, which is in fact a flag, either red flag or a green flag, where red flag stands for unacceptable risk and green flag stands for acceptable risk. This flag is dependent on the risk characterization ratio value, PBT properties, and hazard conclusion type. Nevertheless, the user may override the risk control flag by using the override risk control column. There, he may set the no to yes, and in that case, the risk control flag will turn to green. Nevertheless, it doesn't say yes, but yes manual. When doing this, the user nevertheless is required to enter a remark to justify such a change, why he would think that RCR is above 1 is still considered acceptable. And the last thing to say is that at the bottom of the page, there are few free text parameters or free text areas where user can fill also additional text, which also would travel together with all the other information to the biocides report. With this, I covered, I think, all the features which are of relevance to the biocides users in relation to the environmental risk assessment. I thank you for your attention, and I hand over to my colleague, which will talk about the scientific updates in the environmental risk assessment.
Hello, I am Stefano Frattini, and here I will get you through the scientific updates of environmental risk assessment introduced in Chesar Platform. While developing Chesar Platform, scientific improvements to environmental assessment were included. Main changes introduced are discussed here, namely the Simple Treat 4 implementation, the OPS module to estimate air concentration and deposition from air emissions, the new equation for volatilization from soil, and the correction temperature equations. You can also retrieve more information in Chesar Platform release note. We start with Simple Treat 4, which is now implemented in Chesar Platform. Following its implementation, the sewage treatment plant distribution towards compartment, the fractions are degraded, discharged via water and air, or ending up into the sludge, are substantially different than those estimated in Chesar 3 and uses 212. In particular, we can observe higher removal via biodegradation and or sedimentation to sludge in the sewage treatment plant, and as a consequence, the PECs the predicted environmental concentration are then substantially different unless the STP is bypassed. Moreover, Chesar Platform now offers the possibility to use a specific test measuring degradation in the STP, in line with the Simple Treat 4. For example, test estimating the DT50 for biodegradation in the STP, or test estimating the percentage removed from the STP. The results of these tests should be reported in Euclid, will be imported in Chesar Platform and used for the assessment. Another scientific improvement is the implementation of new formulas of the OPS model to estimate air concentrations and deposition. Following to this new equation, air concentration slightly increases by a factor of about 15%. For air deposition, a new dependency of gaseous deposition with Henry constant is now introduced. Moreover, the volatilization to soil equation is now reversed to the old uses, 1, to better account for limited accumulation in soil of very volatile substances. It is important to note that as a consequence, the PEC soil can now be slightly different than in Chesar 3 and uses both 212 and 220 due to that. Finally, a new equation to estimate biodegradation and hydrolysis at environmental temperature has been implemented. This has small impact on the estimation of DT50 value for biodegradation and hydrolysis at environmental temperature. In particular, for REACH, only the regional scale, so the PECs regional, are impacted, with the only exception of soil, where also the local concentration in soil may be impacted. Thank you, and with that we are ready to move to the next presentation. I hand over to my colleague Silvia Tanarro.
Hello again. In this presentation, I will focus on how to generate reports, do the export to Euclid, and how to migrate assessments from Chesar 3 to Chesar Platform. So the first part of the presentation is the report generation. These are different reports depending on the regulatory context. So for REACH, you will have the chemical safety report and the safety dataset exposure scenarios. And then for biocides, there is the BPR risk assessment report, in this case, only for the environment. Here you have again the workflow. And here in the workflow, you see that generating the reports happens at the end of the process. So basically, you have done already your assessment, you have already concluded, set the uses to save, etc. And then you simply want to document your assessment. For that, you can generate for REACH the chemical safety report, that is the document that you need to attach to the registration, and the exposure scenarios for communication that will go in the SDS. For BPR, you will have the BPR report. So how you do the report generation? In this example, I will take a REACH assessment, but it will be the same workflow for the biocides. So first, you need some preparatory work, or at least to check a number of things. So the first thing is really to check that you are covering all your uses, you have assessed them all, etc. So that you can see here where you have the green ticks. Then you also need to check that everything is safe. So there are no actions in progress. And finally, it is always useful to check the validations. And sometimes you will still get validations and it's fine, but you need to check that you don't need to do anything about them. Once you have done this, then you can really go on and generate your report. The first step is to generate a report preview. So you go to this bottom at the right part of the screen that says View Report, and then you choose which report you want to generate. In this case, because it's REACH, you have Chemical Safety Report and SDS. If it will be the biocides, then you will have only the BPR report. If we take, for instance, the Chemical Safety Report, you will generate the preview, and when you generate the preview, in the left side, you will get the table of contents. This table of contents has links to all the uses so you can easily navigate, but then it also offers you the possibility of editing the report. So there are a number of places where you can add information in text fields, and this will also be synchronized with your assessment. So whatever you edit here, it will be safe in case you want to generate the report again later on, etc. So you have done that, you have edited all you need to edit, and now you are ready to generate your CSR. You press the button Generate CSR. In the case of the CSR, you have two options, generate sections 9 and 10 and generate the full CSRs. Because at the moment you cannot generate the full CSR, this option is grayed out, but it will be possible in the future. And for the time being, you can generate 1 to 8 with Euclid and then 9, 10 separately and then merge them. Once you press Generate CSR, you will get the options of getting a PDF or a Word document. You pick whatever fits, and then it will be downloaded on your PC. And exactly the same thing will happen for the VPR assessment report or for the SDS report. So basically, this is how you generate your reports. Then the next part is really how you export to Euclid. This is only applicable to REACH assessments. And here you have it again in the workflow. This is also something that normally happens when you have finalized your assessment. And then what you want to do is to export your uses and at times also your exposure and risk assessment data. So this way you are sure that you are reporting the same uses in your CSR and in Euclid. How you do this? Simply you press first, you first need to do again some preparatory work. So you need to make sure that you have the same substance properties in Euclid and in your Chesar platform. So you use the synchronization button. And then once this is done, this is synchronized. Then you also check again that no saving actions are in progress. And then you can move on to do the export. So you press these 3 dots, and then you have a menu, you pick Export Uses to Euclid, and you will get a screen where you can select whether you want simply to export the uses, or you also want to include the exposure information. You pick your choice, and then you export. Then the last part of my presentation focuses on what you do when you have assessments in Chesar 3, and you want to transfer them to Chesar Platform. This, you have to know that is only supported for assessments that have been done in Chesar 3.9 or 3.9.1 and is only applicable for REACH. So this happens a little bit in the middle. So really you decide, okay, I have this assessment and I want to import it. So then you import it and you get all this into the Chesar platform. So how I migrate an assessment from Chesar 3 into Chesar Platform. The first thing is, it's relatively easy, so you simply use the import button. That can be also used to import assessment from Chesar Platform to Chesar Platform, so it's the same one. You simply import. Then you need to select the Chesar 3 file. So you need to have your Chesar 3 file already saved somewhere, and you have to know that it will only work for Chesar substance files. So other files like CSA files, CSA blocks, use maps, etc. will not be migrated. It will give you an error. And also, as I have said before, it has to be a Chesar 3.9 or Chesar 391 file. If you are using other Chesar file from older versions, you need to transfer it to Chesar 3.9 before you can import it into Chesar Platform. And then the migration of substances with assessment entities is not supported. So this is what you need to know. Chesar 3 files, substance files for simple substances. This is what you can import. And then you simply choose it and you import it. So when you press import and you have picked the substance, you will get a panel, and this panel will have the name of the substance and the assessments that are recorded for this substance. As you know, Chesar Platform works at assessment level, not at substance level. So if you have 2 CSAs, you will get 2 assessments in Chesar Platform. You simply select the ones that you want and you press import. After pressing import, the importing and the migration will be carried out as a background task. This means that you can start doing something else, and this will be happening in the background, and you will have a task panel to see the progress. Once the migration is completed, you will get the chemical safety assessment appearing in the Chesar Platform. So there you have the 2 assessments that you have migrated, and you will still have the task panel where you will see the important data from the migration. So you will see the substance, you will see the CSAs, you will see if they have been migrated or not. In this case, both were successful. And you also get some further details. So you see that you have some folder. If you press the folder, you will simply open the assessment in Chesar Platform directly. If you press the other one, you will download some zip files with important information. This information normally will not be super useful for you, but for instance, you will get there the error, an error file if the assessment has not been migrated, so you can send this to us to know what has happened, etc. And then the last thing I want to explain to you is that we have done a migration guidance that is available. So there you have a step-by-step how you can do your migration. And then you also have the list of limitations that are caused mainly by difference in the data structure and between the architecture of the tools. So there you can see what to check. For instance, what calculations could have changed, because that recalculation will happen when you move to from one tool to the other. You will know what are the limitations, what has not been migrated, what has been migrated in a different way, etc. So I strongly recommend to look at this migration guidance if you are migrating assessment from Chesar 3 to Chesar Platform. And with that, I have finished, so thank you for your attention.
Okay, well, with this last section on reports, export to Euclid, and migration from Chesar 3, we have basically taken you through, at a high level, the workflow in Chesar Platform. Now I would like to say some last words about the next steps for Chesar Platform, but also for Chesar 3 and the uses, and to tell you about where to get support when you start using the tool. First of all, let's have a look at the next steps for Chesar Platform. As mentioned before, we expect to make available desktop and server installations of Chesar Platform by the end of this year. The idea is that those should allow you to add Chesar Platform on top of an existing Euclid 6 desktop or server installation. The further development of Chesar Platform will take place based on ECHA's priorities and resources. Here are the next steps for the tools which you have been using so far, Chesar 3 and the uses. So as a starting point for this, it's important to remember that the intention is that Chesar Platform will replace Chesar 3 and the uses. It will also replace the Excel sheets for biocides for calculating emissions, but as not all emission scenarios are included in Chesar Platform yet, this replacement will be a bit more gradual. Also important to say here is that the latest scientific updates will only be available in Chesar Platform, so the latest environmental and worker models. And that means that Chesar 3 and the uses will become, or actually already are, outdated. Of course, we understand that it may take some time for you to transfer from Chesar 3, for instance, to Chesar Platform. So we're planning to support Chesar 3 for 1 more year, so until April 2027, around then. So we really invite you to take advantage of the time that these two tools coexist. Start to get to know Chesar Platform, start transferring some of your assessments from Chesar 3 into Chesar Platform when you're ready, so that you will be prepared for the next phase when Chesar Platform will be the only tool available. If you would like to remain updated on the developments related to Chesar Platform, first of all, make sure that you subscribe to the Chesar Platform news. You can find the subscribe button on the Chesar Platform homepage, and by subscribing, you will be informed when any news is published on the Chesar Platform website. If you would like to follow a bit more closely, or you would like to contribute to the discussions related to Chesar Platform, but also related to the risk assessment methodology in a more general sense, you can also choose to join the Chemical Risk Assessment Stakeholders community. In the past years, for instance, we have shared updates with that stakeholder community, discussed with subgroups on changes to the environmental assessment and on the harmonization of the conditions of use for workers, and we have also asked in this group for volunteers for beta testing. So, if that sounds good and you would like to join, please send us a message to our Chesar Platform email, which is mentioned here. Last but not least, some information on the available support. First of all, I would like to remind you on the help text, which has been included directly in the tool. You can access it by clicking on the little eye icon, which appears in different places in the tool. Then, on the Chesar Platform webpage, you can find some valuable supporting material published together with the release. There is, first of all, an access manual, which explains how to access Chesar Platform in ECHA Cloud Services. Then there are release notes for V1, which provide a lot of very useful information, and we really advise that you have a look at this document. So it contains information on the known issues, so if you run into something, you can see whether we're already aware. But it also contains the information on the scientific changes which have been implemented in V1 of Chesar Platform. And it also gives some overview on the main differences between Chesar Platform and Chesar 3. So very useful maybe for Chesar 3 users. Then there is also a user manual which gives you a more high-level overview and information. And if you're migrating your substances from Chesar 3 into Chesar Platform, then the migration manual, which will also be there, will guide you through that step by step. And last but not least, if you need more support than is available in the documentation or then in the help text, we also have a dedicated help desk form for Chesar Platform. You can find it on the ECHA website by going to Contact in the top right, then select Technical Support, and then you will see the Chesar Platform logo. I also added a direct link to the website, the web help desk form, if you want to go in that way. And When you're contacting the help desk, especially if you have an issue, it will really help us a lot if you give a clear explanation on the steps you have taken and any other information that you have that can help us to reproduce the issue that you're running into. In that case, for instance, sharing screenshots and, if possible, even files would be very useful so that we are able to help you as efficiently as possible. That brings me to the end of this section on the next steps, how to follow the developments, and how to get support. Thank you. And I now hand over to our host, Adam, for some conclusions.
Thank you to our presenters for the detailed walkthrough of the new Chesar platform. Now, before we move to the Q&A, I'll briefly summarize the main points from today. We've seen how the platform brings together the work previously done in Chesar and e-uses, and how version 1 supports key workflows for reach and biocides assessments. We've also looked at how assessments are created and managed, how the workflow is structured, and how the platform supports exposure assessment, risk characterization, and reporting. So let's now recap the key take-home messages. To conclude, today's webinar has introduced Chesar Platform as the new common platform bringing together Chesar and e-uses. Version 1 supports important reach and biocides assessment workflows. These range from creating assessments and building uses and scenarios through to exposure assessment, risk characterization, and reporting. We've also seen that the platform includes scientific updates, especially in environmental assessment, and that it will gradually replace Chesar 3, e-uses, and the biocides emission Excel sheets. Now, as you start using the platform, we strongly recommend checking the available guidance, release notes, and support material, as these explain scientific changes and practical steps for migration and use. We'll now close the presentation part of the webinar. The Q&A remains open until 1 Helsinki time, and we'll keep answering as many questions as possible until the event ends. Still, you can send your questions through Slido using the QR code on the slide, or by going to slido.com and entering the event code shown here. As mentioned earlier, we'll focus on questions that are within the scope of today's webinar. If you have a question for a specific speaker, include their name in your question. You can also upvote questions from other participants to help us prioritize the topics that are most useful for you. If we don't manage to answer your question, we'll include replies in the Q&A document published after the event. So, thank you very much for joining us today. We hope this webinar has helped you get a clearer picture of what Chesar Platform offers, how to start working with it, and where to find support as you begin using it. The recording, presentations, and Q&A will be available on the ECHO website after the event. On the Chesar Platform pages, you can find guidance, release notes, and more support material. Many thanks again to our presenters, our experts, and everyone who joined us today. We hope you found the session useful. Thank you, and goodbye.